This UCSD TV program is a presentation of University of California Television for educational and non-commercial use only.
Good morning and welcome. Richard C. Atkinson is President Emeritus of the University of California and Professor Emeritus at UC San Diego. He served as President of the UC system from 1995 to 2003. His tenure was marked by innovative approaches to admissions, outreach, and research initiatives to accelerate the university's contribution to the state's economy. Before becoming president, he served for 15 years as chancellor of the UC San Diego. He led its emergence as one of the leading research universities in the nation. He is a former director of the National Science Foundation, past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and was a long-term faculty member at Stanford University. His research is focused on problems of memory and cognition. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Education, and the American Philosophical Society. And a mountain in the Antarctic is named in his honor. Welcome, Dr. Atkinson.
Now, what's the definition of a research university? I'm not going to worry about a definition for this morning. The Carnegie Foundation for the advancement of teaching, occasionally, usually about once every 5 years, publishes a categorization of universities. That's on the internet. You can go to it very easily. Usually when I make a remark like that, people go right to the internet and have it right before them. But the Carnegie Foundation lists over 4,000 institutions of higher education. 4,000, over 4,000. These are universities, these are colleges, there are some freestanding institutions. For example, the California Western School of Law here would be one of these freestanding institutions. 4,000 of these institutions. In the Carnegie Foundation, they have two categories for research universities. One they call Research Universities, VH, a very high level of research activity. And then they have the second category, Research Universities, high research level of activity. So of these 4,000 plus institutions, about 200 by the Carnegie Foundation are classified as research universities. But the fact is that 80% of the funds expended in the academic sector are expended by the top 100 institutions. 30% of the funds expended are expended by 20% of the institutions, and the top 10 institutions expend about 18% of the funds. So yes, there are 200 research universities in this categorization, but many institutions that fall into the second category expend a fairly minimal amount. It tends to be fairly concentrated in about 100 universities. Indeed, there's an organization called the American Association of Universities, which has always viewed itself as the premier association of research universities, and it only has about 65 members. Now, what's interesting about that association is that one state is very peculiar in the association. We have 9 institutions in the state of California that are research universities in the American Association of Universities, and of course all 9 of those would clearly fall in the Carnegie Foundation's top 100. No other state even comes close to that number. If you want an questions, comment session, I'd be happy to give you numbers on specific states. Well, what are the institutions that are in the AAU, the American Association of Universities from California? There are three publics. There are three privates, Stanford, Caltech, and USC, and 6 University of California campuses: UCLA, UC Berkeley, UC San Diego, Santa Barbara, Davis, and Irvine. Quite interesting. Again, there is no other public university system in the country that has, someone will contradict this, but it's not quite right, but there's no other university system in the country that has more than one member, namely its key member as a member of the American Association of Universities. Just to give you a sense of it, if you look at the top, unless we just describe these 9 institutions in California, if you look at the ones who fall in the top 5 in terms of federal funds for research, UCLA and UC San Diego fit into the top 5 on a quite regular basis year by year. In the next 5, Stanford fits in, and then in the next 5, UC Berkeley fits in, but all fit in within the top 25. What's unique, I think, from your perspective is here's UC Berkeley, not in the top 5, not in the second 5, but actually in the third 5. Well, that's a peculiarity because they do not have a medical school. And if you mix the UC San Francisco Medical School with UC Berkeley, it would be number 1 in the country year in and year out. So California is a rather interesting situation in terms of the number of research universities. And then what I would like to do now is try to describe how all of this came about. And it really has come about since World War II. I think the conclusion I'll arrive at is that the research universities and the basic research that they do are a driving force in the American economy, and that to a certain extent, although many other countries are beginning to model themselves after our university system, to a certain extent, our approach has been quite unique over time. Now, as I said earlier, prior to World War II, research universities, or some of the major universities in the country, really accounted for a small amount of research. There was research going on, funded by foundations, funded by the university's endowments, but virtually no dollars coming from the federal government. In fact, I'm going to say no dollars coming from the federal government to support research in universities. In fact, I think there was a philosophical position among many educators, many people in higher education, that accepting federal money could distort the academic process, could distort academia. But World War II came along, and I now recognize quite a few people in this audience who were active in the scientific endeavors of World War II. But during World War II, obviously, science played a very important part in the success that this nation had. Slightly before the start of World War II, President Roosevelt turned to a colleague or a friend of his, a man named Vannevar Bush. Some people like to pronounce that Vannevar Bush, but the correct pronunciation, or at least Dr. Bush's pronunciation, was Vannevar. Vannevar Bush was a former professor at MIT, was at the Carnegie Foundation in Washington at the time. Very conservative politically, but interesting in the fact, it's interesting that President Roosevelt turned to him to be his science advisor. And once the war broke out, the programs that he was responsible for expanded very rapidly. And one only needs to look at the success that the United States had during World War II that was based on the scientific enterprise to realize how important it was. Of course, the atomic bomb, UC Berkeley, UC Chicago, University of Chicago played a key role there. The establishment of the Los Alamos laboratories was run by the University of California, continues to be. High-frequency radar developed at MIT, the laboratories there. the proximity fuse, sonar, oceanography, the work done at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, very critical, cryptography, a long list, antimalarial drugs, there are a long list of developments. Well, how was the war effort organized? It was very heavily organized around universities and around university scientists. So that, for example, there was research going on at Berkeley, but it would also, Berkeley would then in turn fund research at other universities related to atomic energy. And the same thing was true in many other areas. So the research enterprise of the United States during World War II was heavily, obviously industry played a tremendously important role, but the university community played a very key role in all of this. And near the end of the war, President Roosevelt turned to Vannevar Bush and asked him to form a committee of people to examine the experiences of World War II and to judge from those experiences how that experience could be applied to the organization of science in the post-World War II period. The report was finally published in July of 1945. President Roosevelt had died at that time. President Truman was in place. And the report has a very interesting title. It's called Science, the Endless Frontier. And of course, the United States was a country of frontiers. And when Bush used this term, it was to describe yet another frontier, the frontier of science, and the rather interesting description, the endless frontier. What was the nature of the Vannevar Bush report? And I should give credit to the other people involved, but it really is thought of as the Bush report. And I should say that Vannevar Bush has no relationship to either of our presidents. The nature of the report, and I'm being here a little vague. If you look at the paper, Research University's Core of Science and Technology, you'll see that I'm much more careful about how I describe these matters. There is certain issues of military research and the like that are characterized more carefully in these papers, but I will ignore in my remarks today. What was the thrust of the report? Well, one thrust was that who should be responsible for funding the research and development enterprise of the United States? Well, the conclusion was that the responsibility for funding the applied research and development activities was a private sector responsibility. That was industry's responsibility. But what about basic research? Who should fund basic research? Bush made the argument, which I think has been very well substantiated in the last 25 years, that it was a public good, that industry, and remember Bush was an engineer himself, an electrical engineer, MIT. He really did understand industry, was deeply immersed in industrial activities. But Bush's argument was that the responsibility for funding basic research was a government responsibility. One could not expect industry to be a significant funder of basic research. Please don't tell me about Bell Labs and the like, just bear with me on some of this. So the Bush argument was that too often, if an industry was pursuing basic research, the likelihood of it being useful to them was never certain. The likelihood that it might even support a competitor company was a problem. So the view was that basic research was a public good, should be supported by the federal government. Then the next question was, well, who should perform that research? Well, again, industry was responsible for applied research and development, and they clearly had the responsibility of performing the research, but who should perform the basic research of the country, which was to be funded by the federal government? Well, if you look at countries like France at that period or the Soviet Union, most basic research was funded in institutes run by the federal government. Bush's argument was no, It should be funded at the research universities of the nation. That is, the research universities of the nation should be the driving force behind that. Now, that's kind of an interesting idea, and one that you can see would cause people to worry a little. I mean, the research universities playing that significant a role, that is being responsible for basic research, being responsible for what many people view, and I think correctly, as the driving force of the whole R&D enterprise. Well, that was Bush's view. And the third thing that, for those who know the report carefully, will see that I've been more careful about how I've stated this in my written remarks. The third comment that I would make is that Bush argued that the funding of these research universities should not be the government making a decision, you're a research university or you're a research university, but it should be based on a peer review process. That is, that individual scientists or groups of scientists should be submitting proposals for their research, and that the funding of the research would then be evaluated by a group of peers, supposedly people who had similar academic, scientific credentials. And so the peer review process was key to defining how the funding of these universities' research activities should be. And then the other thing that Bush recommended was that there should be one foundation, which he called the National Research Foundation. There should be one foundation, and all basic research should flow, all federal funding for basic research should flow through that single foundation, where the foundation would be governed by the peer review process, would be funding universities, but all research would be funded, all basic research would be funded through that foundation. Well, this is 1940, that report's issued in 45, the war ends. There's a divided Congress as there is today. It's the 80th Congress for those people who remember that period. A very contentious time between President Truman and the Congress, and much debate. Well, where do we end up? In time, the notion of a National Research Foundation as a single channel for research funding, that idea disappears into the background. Quickly, the idea is that NIH should begin to expand its extramural research programs. Indeed, the view came that every agency, every major agency of the United States government had a responsibility for funding basic research that fell in its area. But then in addition, the idea was proposed that there should be a National Science Foundation. And so the term National Science Foundation was proposed. And what was the idea here? Yes, these agencies should be funding basic research, but there should be one foundation committed to just funding basic research. And in a certain sense, it should look like a balancing wheel. It should always be looking at all of the research going on in the supported by the federal government, and trying to find areas where there isn't quite the right balance in terms of the best interest for American science, and stepping in to ensure that the appropriate research was done in that area. I would argue that that balancing wheel concept was absolutely critical. That is, the NSF role in establishing the internet was critical. It was critical in plant biology, in the development of plant biology. It's a very interesting story with regard to cryptography in the National Security Agency, but that's for another time. The point I'm trying to get to is this structure that was formed in the debate in the years after the Bush report came out was a commitment to the idea of basic research being funded by the federal government, that its funds being flowing to universities, but then that the whole government, the various agencies of the government, had responsibility for funding it, but there was one organization that had a very special responsibility, and that was the National Science Foundation. And established with the foundation was the National Science Board. These are individuals appointed by the President and confirmed by the Congress that would serve as the National Science Board, the Board of Advisors. And Don Shields is here today, and I haven't seen Don in 30 years, I think. But Don was a member of the board when I was director of the National Science Foundation. So that's the concept of the National Science Foundation as it evolved. And finally, in 1950, the foundation comes into existence. But in the intervening years, NIH had expanded, NSF had expanded. There was a flow of funding already going to research universities, and the program was beginning to formalize. Well, what was the result? The result is where we are today, and I'll gradually get to that. But the result was that I believe it can be demonstrated that research universities have become the driving force in the American research and development enterprise, and that the situation in the United States is, for research universities, is really somewhat unique. Now remember, I'm talking about research universities. I'm talking about a small number of institutions from a political perspective, 100 to 200. And one has to always wonder about the political viability of the funds being concentrated in such a small number of institutions when one looks at the array of institutions. And the politics of this has at times gotten very interesting. Well, in my paper, the research university paper, I break, the history starts back with the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but I'm not going that far back. But I've now taken you through the 40s, from World War II up to 1950 with the establishment of NSF. I then have a 25-year period, 50 to 1975, that I think is a defined period in this history. And then another defined period is 1975 to 2000. And so I'm going to describe those two periods. And then at the end, I'll make some general remarks about where we are today. 1975, NSF is established. I think the logic of Vannevar Bush's report is pretty well accepted, namely that the government does have a responsibility for funding basic research. And things move along, but for those who remember the early 1950s, it was a slow period for the United States, and universities, after the influx of the GIs after the war, sort of slowed down. Everything was just moving along at a very slow pace. And there was, NSF did have some funds for supporting research universities, but they were fairly minimal. But they gradually increased through the early 50s. But then, October 1957, Sputnik. The world changes almost instantaneously. President Eisenhower, within a month, appoints a science advisor and appoints PSAC, the President's Scientific Advisory Council. Shortly thereafter, there's what's called the National Education Act, NDEA, a huge funding of universities, but much of it devoted to graduate education, the production of PhDs in the sciences and engineering. A very wonderful moment in time for the academic research enterprise. Funding goes up following 1957 at quite a fast rate, not just for NSF, but all the agencies funding research universities. And during that, the 2 decades from 1950 to 1970, I'm going to quote from my paper. I say, the 2 decades witnessed the flowering of the American research university system as it came to be acknowledged as the core of the country's science and technology system. It was a remarkable period. During that 20-year period, all the Nobel Prizes in physics had an American's name on them. Some of them were shared, but all were American scientists. Chemistry, 18 of the 26 Nobel Prizes went to Americans. Physiology and medicine, all 26 went to Americans. And almost every one of them came from an American research university. But by 1970, there were some clouds on the horizon. U.S. industry, for the first time, was really facing stiff competition. I know a lot of you here in the room remember that. 1970s were very worrisome in terms of our ability to compete in so many markets that we dominated at an earlier point. There was a clear uneasiness on the part of industry on their relationship with research universities, because before World War II, even though there was no federal money flowing to universities to support research, there had been close cooperative relationships between various companies and schools of engineering and departments of physics and chemistry in research activity. It was fairly significant. And I have those numbers. But once the Vannevar-Bush report came along and the flow of funding after Sputnik, the simple fact was that there was so much money flowing to the universities that they lost interest in the arrangements with industry. The money was just too easy to come by through the federal government. And there was also the sense that it was just awfully tough to get ideas from the university transferred into the private sector. Technology transfer just wasn't working very well. So industry was not too pleased with the universities and the research enterprise. The work that was being done was phenomenally excellent, but was it really contributing to the industrial productivity of the country? This was also the time of the Vietnam War. President Nixon was less than happy with the university community. During that period, President Nixon fired his science advisor. There had been a science advisor from Eisenhower forward. Nixon fired his science advisor because he was not happy with some advice that he received. His advisor told him that he did not think the United States should pursue a supersonic transport, what the Europeans, did in terms of the Concorde. His advice was, the president did not like that advice, and he was really quite annoyed with the opposition that he received from the academic community regarding the war. And the Science Peace Act was not helpful to Nixon in that sense either. So Nixon was less than happy, and all of these things led, in a sense, to a demise in to a drop-off in the funding for university research. Throughout those years, it always increased, but if you looked at funding for university research in constant dollars, it hit its peak in 1980 and began to decline thereafter. So by 1975, the world for research universities is somewhat bleak. There's a real uneasiness in the country about the situation we find ourselves in. And now I'm going to be rather personal in my remarks. July 1 of 1975, I go to Washington. I'm appointed as Deputy Director of the National Science Foundation. President Ford is now in place. The director of the National Science Foundation is a man named Guy Stever, a physicist who was who worked with Vannevar-Bush, was really mentored by Vannevar-Bush. I may be wasting a little time here, but there's a wonderful story I can tell about him. Guy Stever, as I said, worked for Vannevar Bush through the war years. On the second day of the invasion of Europe, he led a small team of scientists to inspect V2 sites, V1 sites. They landed on the beach. The American forces said they liberated a V2 site up the road. They all climbed into 2 jeeps. They went storming up to this V2 site. It was about, I guess, 20 miles from the beach. And it was still occupied by the Germans. So they had an interesting discussion with the Germans, and the German commander surrendered. New York Times, next day, front page coverage of Guy Stever and the events of the occupation of that force. You'll remember that front page of the New York Times hung in the offices of the National Science Foundation. I've got a problem. I guess I've got the same problem that the new speaker, the new Republican Speaker of the House has. I'm getting a little too emotional in some of my remarks here. In any event, I arrived in Washington at that time, and I think it's fair to say that NSF was in a state of some uneasiness. Some of you will remember Senator Proxmire and the Golden Fleeces. Whenever Senator Proxmire issued a golden fleece, I always thought he was right on target until he started issuing them to the National Science Foundation. And then I was less than happy. In fact, that had been going on a number of years before I got to Washington. One of the most famous of that period was the sex life of the screwworm fly. And Senator Proxmire had great fun with that. And so waste and abuse, and clearly a lot of what people judged to be basic research was waste and abuse. After Sputnik, NSF was forced into the science education business, and I say forced because the leadership of NSF did not want to get into science education. They felt that it would divert funds from their key areas of interest, but they were forced by the Congress. The Congress didn't really quite trust the Office of Education. There was no Department of Education in those days, so NSF had responsibility for curriculum in the K through 12 era, a grade period, grades. And it's interesting, things went very well with the new math. I know some of you will think, oh, it wasn't all great, but it really was excellent. The new physics, new chemistry, but once they got into biology, they ran into real trouble because soon they were talking about evolution and cultural diversity and the like. The term cultural diversity meant a different thing in those days, and they were a lot of criticism. But then there was also the great concern about how effective was the transfer of technology to the private sector. And again, if you remember Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, it sort of was, a question, was science the problem in the environment and so forth. So that's where we are in 1975. One of the first acts of President Ford, indeed, I think he did it within the day of becoming president, was to turn to who then became the vice president, Nelson Rockefeller, and indicate that he wanted to reestablish the Science Advisor's Office again. It had not quite been ended, but just bear with my language here. So the first thing he wanted to do was to reestablish the PSAC, the President's Scientific Advisory Committee, and a science advisor. It had been done by Eisenhower as simply a White House directive. Ford decided that it should be something more permanent and wanted the Congress to carry out congressional legislation. And within 6 months of my arrival, the congressional legislation was approved, and Guy Stever leaves NSF to become the director, to become the science advisor to President Ford. To say the least, President Ford and Nelson Rockefeller, his vice president, were tremendously supportive of science and tremendously supportive of the National Science Foundation. But there were two issues that I'm now going to talk about that I think characterize that period. I think a more complete history of the period would talk about the role of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Research Council, and the Congress in terms of restructuring our policies with regard to science. But I'm going to just describe two issues that I think are important that evolved directly out of NSF. One was that it became very evident when we went before the Congress describing the importance of basic research was that we had lots of anecdotal evidence, but we didn't have any hard economic data. We couldn't turn to the field of economics and say, yes, we really understand how investments in basic research, how investments drive economic progress and the like. And so NSF did something fairly unusual at that time. It started to fund a program of research inviting economists and others, engineers, anyone who were interested in looking at investments in research and development, but particularly investments in basic research and their implications for the economy. And you might be surprised, but the economists had really not tackled this issue. In 1975, there were a handful of papers that economists had done looking at some of these topics, but not much had been done of a significant nature. And so we began to fund individual economists, scientists, and the like to focus on that area. And over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, it really blossomed into a very important part of economics. And the term that I'll use is new growth theory. That's a way of summarizing the economic theory that evolved. And in my paper, the Israeli paper, I go into it in some detail. And for those who are not familiar with it, I would suggest you look at that paper. But not too long ago, the president's, well, not this president, well, it was actually President Clinton's Council on Economic Advisors. Tyson was the head of the council at the time. They issued a report summarizing new growth theory. And I'm not going to try to summarize that report, but basically they said that if you looked at economic progress in the United States in the last 40 years, during the last, and this is going to be rather striking, during the last 40 years, 50% of the growth in the American economy was due to investments in research and development. Kind of amazing. Now, for the economists not to really have understood that issue as early as the 1970s is intriguing. One doesn't always have a lot of faith in what economists have to say on some of these issues. But I think new growth theory has really been well established. And in the Israeli paper, at a fairly simple level, really focus on some of the findings and their conception. So the argument is that basic research is a public good, and one can really demonstrate the relationship between investments and economic activity. Well, the other thing we did at NSF was we set up a small group and brought in some of the most distinguished individuals in the country, both from industry and from universities, to look at this whole issue of technology transfer and all issues that related to improving the general well-being of the research and development enterprise. And again, I'm not going to list for now the various proposals that we made. Some of them were, in fact, a number of them were enacted. There's a very nice listing that I can refer you to. But some of the proposals were related to tax incentives for investing in research, particularly issues related to cooperation between industry and universities in terms of cooperative activities, and some of the conflicts of interest that could arise and how they should be dealt with. But then, most important of all, in my judgment, was a bill called the Bayh-Dole Bill. Before the Bayh-Dole Bill was passed in 1980, but before 1980, any research that was funded by the federal government owned the intellectual property rights to that research. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean just that. The work may have been carried out by a particular scientist at a particular university, but the intellectual property to that work was owned by the federal government. Well, it just simply, once in the federal government's domain, first of all, people didn't want to even bother getting patents on their work, because it would be, the patents would be the property of the United States government. And so it was really an issue of how can you free up the patents and really get this intellectual property into the private sector. Well, the Bayh-Dole Bill came to the following conclusion. It said, we're going to transfer the intellectual property rights to the universities. So any work, we're going to fund the work in universities, but the intellectual property rights for any patents or intellectual discovery, and I'm losing the terms here, but will reside in at the university. Now, the universities over time have responded to this by generally saying, yes, the royalties flow to the university, but we're going to share them. The scientists involved will get a certain portion, and the university will get, it gets a little complicated, and it varies somewhat from university to university, but clearly a university where an important discovery is made by a team or a scientist, those funds, the royalties that relate to the application of that work will flow back to the university. And that was the Bayh-Dole Bill. That was written by, the initial draft of the Bayh-Dole Bill was written at NSF. I personally recruited Senator Dole and Senator Bayh. Bayh was the father of the Senator Bayh of this more recent period, who's, I think, now governor of Indiana, but and Dole, of course, was a Republican. Bayh was a Democrat. Dole was a Republican, ran for vice president on the Republican ticket some years ago. But that legislation was passed in 1980. It took a while for universities to quite understand what had happened, but slowly, in some places much more quickly, patent offices were established for technology transfer offices, and now it's an ongoing set of activities, and you'll see that we work very hard at the university to identify work that's going on that is patentable, and then we work very hard to ensure that those patents are made known to a wide set of potential industrial partners for the intellectual property. I think the Bayh-Dole Bill has been really critical in redefining the role of the research university and ensuring the effective transfer of research from the university into the applied sector. My paper, Research University's Core of Science and Technology, ends with an account of where we stand today. And really, it's a list of the many issues that face the viability and productivity of the research university sector. They get rather picky at times, and I think I'd rather just respond to some comments about the current state of universities in response to questions and comments that you might have. So at this point, I think I'd like to end. Thank you for your attention. You've been a very attentive audience. Someone said to me that you often had a mix of speakers, some very entertaining and others not so entertaining. I suspect that I'm going to fall in the second category, but thank you, Stan.
I wonder if, in fact, especially now that funding is down from a federal point of view, if the percentage of research funded by industry has increased in percentage, number one. The second part of my question is...
Oh, hey, just let me stay right
go
there.
ahead.
I made a terrible mistake. I should have talked about that. Because that has rebounded quite dramatically. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, I want to interrupt you by saying I should have mentioned that earlier. It's the industry-supported activity in universities has rebounded quite dramatically. As I said, before World War II, it was up around 5%. It dropped down to virtually nothing by the late 60s, and now it's back up around 5 or 6%. I don't know what the right number should be. For a place like MIT, it's probably higher than 5%, but here we have quite a bit of it. One of the things that was done at NSF was to establish what was called the Industry University Cooperative Research Program, and that was in our day, and that invited proposals from scientists in industry and universities to make a joint proposal where working together there was some opportunity for significant progress. The NSF funded the university side of it, industry funded its side. There was great concern in the National Science Board about whether we should have such a program. A lot of scientists were not too pleased with the idea, but once we started, the quality of the proposals were phenomenal. So the bridging within, and if you look at my Israeli paper, I end with a discussion about some of the issues that focus just on that. If you look at the California Institute of Telecommunication and Information Processing, CAL-IT2 here, or the other three California Institutes for Science and Technology that were set up about 8 years ago or 10 years ago, they're all focused on joint work with industry. So I think the bridges back to industry have been reestablished. Again, you don't want it to go too far. You don't want the university being run by industry, but I think we're at a good balance now.
Okay. Well, my second
Oh,
question...
and let me just say a little further. You know, it's so important for students to have those contacts with industry, to understand what's going on in industry, and you know, so they have an opportunity to be placed in some of these companies. No, I think we do a lot of that with biotechnology. We do a lot in telecommunication here at this institution. I think one of the most important remarks I should have made was that we've sort of, after 1980, really worked to restore that balance, that industry-university relationship.
Okay. Well, the second part of my question is perhaps a personal concern. Obviously, industrial support is intended to be self-benefiting. I mean, it's something that they're selling or looking for. I recognize that universities must have committees that review research proposals and have to accept those proposals as being appropriate. I also recognize that just in very recent time, that journals now are requiring disclosure, funding disclosure, who funded the project. But I'm concerned, or I ask, what federal mechanism is out there for people to report impropriety or to review the findings of those committees? Because in fact, there are some studies that have been done at very highly respected universities. I'm talking of University of California, UCLA, Northwestern, Harvard, that were totally inappropriate and yet went through committee. So where is the check and balance on that?
I don't quite know what you have in mind as what was inappropriate. I mean, the issue of falsifying data, and those are issues that were revealing who the funder of your research is.
Specifically, which may help, it was use of placebos that resulted in incorrect conclusions.
I don't know about the research you're citing. I mean, the disclosure of, I mean, there are a lot of mechanisms that we're struggling with. I mean, for example, making data available to other researchers. You know, each science sort of has its own policies, and we're struggling with getting to a point where we have a policy so that people who want data from another researcher can have it. So there are a lot of things, but the placebo thing, you know, what I'm going to say now is going to sound a little strange, but, you know, there's a wonderful article that appeared in the New Yorker just a while ago, sort of questioning this, how solid science is, and what it pointed to is that often a study is reported with significant, statistically significant results. And then someone tries to replicate it, and over the course of time, the effect wears out. Well, I mean, there's this file drawer effect. A lot of people run an experiment, and if it's not successful, they put it in the file drawer and forget it. Someone else runs the same experiment conceptually, and by chance gets a statistically significant result and publishes it. I mean, everything is complicated. And it takes a long time to get things resolved. And even on something like global warming, the science there are just enough really distinguished scientists questioning certain aspects of that, that's becoming an interesting debate. So everything gets complicated, and science is never that clear that you can just simply issue a statement and say, well, that's the way the world is.
One of the effects of the women's liberation movement was the fact that many talented women who used to go into teaching at the elementary level and the high school level left and became doctors and lawyers, and et cetera. And it seems to me that the National Science Foundation, with the money that they're spending, or with some of the money that they're spending on basic research, should also be spending it on giving greater grants to schools of education so that they can begin to train teachers that will encourage children to become scientists.
Well, NSF does do that. That is part of the NSF charge. They had a very, as I told you, it was after Sputnik that they mounted a very significant effort. Summer institutes for science teachers in high school, curriculum development, a whole array of things. But it got very political. And it got so political that when Reagan was elected, if you'll remember Mr. Stockman, who was his budget officer, they eliminated science education from the portfolio of the National Science Foundation. It's something that we've been doing. I wasn't there at the time. And later, Mr. Stockman said in a published article, or published comments, he said, well, I made a mistake, but it's the kind of mistake I don't mind making. But you know, I talked. Why did we got into huge trouble at NSF on science education because of evolution. We had a course called Man, a Course of Study, and in those days, man meant something, but it was, you know, it was a course on anthropological diversity. Man, a Course of Study, and so they had in this course films where these Eskimo tribes would, these Eskimo groups, when man had to go on a long trip across the ice, and his wife wasn't well enough, he'd borrow someone else's wife to go with him. And we had this course, Man, a Course of Study, and everybody went crazy. I mean, there were groups all over the country just wildly upset. Now, of course, the scientific community, most of them thought, what's wrong with all these crazy people? We're just, you know, generating these wonderful courses. But we really had a terrible, terrible time of it. And what happened was that we had done a very sloppy job of the business aspect of funding some of these projects, because they were not the typical university project. An education project developing a course in biology required a whole array of different people and a complexity of funding that was different than what we'd typically done. And we'd really mismanaged, in a certain sense, some of these. This was before my time. But we got into real trouble, and the Congress then could really go at us. That all sort of resolved itself a little later. But there was one congressman, and don't misunderstand this, but I can't help but resist telling you. There was one congressman named Mr. Bauman from Maryland. Mr. Bauman was our severest critic. He had a field day with us, and he was nasty and vicious. And science education was undermining the core values of this country. And he became much of a leader in the Congress in the early days of President Reagan. I'm not knocking President Reagan when I say this. He then was arrested in 1982. You remember this? He was arrested for soliciting young boys for sexual activity. He later wrote a book called A Gentleman from Maryland, The Conscience of a Gay Conservative. And I read that book and I thought, gee, I really felt sorry for him in a certain sense. But then I remembered how he was across the witness table, and my sorrow was softened considerably.